Hey everyone, I spent the last few days digesting our class of last Wednesday, and especially the concerns, criticisms that were raised by several of you. And I just want to take a moment to um, tell you sort of how I'm processing those. Specifically, there's two kinds of criticism I think that were voiced. And I want to thank those of you who sort of put yourselves out there when you didn't have to speak your concern in your own voice and to share the pain that our class has caused you. I think that is it's difficult on the one hand to hear. It's also an important testimony that I think I needed to hear. I trust the class as a whole needed to hear, and it does give us an opportunity to try to reflect on how that pain is being caused and to respond to it. And so the first kind of criticism I think is, as I understand it, the sense that some of you had, especially after reading the Massengale article and the kind of discussion that generated, or just the experience of reading that and how that might also have been sort of anticipated in experiences for you earlier, where uh, for those of you in the class that identify intimately with the survivors of the kind of abuse by police that Massengale was describing, as well as the way that bodies, particularly Black bodies, are objectified in certain ways in pornography, that you felt yourselves, I think, to become too much the object of analysis of our class rather than a vocal participant whose vulnerabilities and pain uh, are being respected and even observed sometimes with a measure of caution about how much we pry into uh, the traumatizing legacy that we're trying to make sense of in our class. And I think that effect is one that I want to take some responsibility for. I am thinking that there is more I could have done to provide some framework for that article in particular, and to um, perhaps provide some better parameters as well for how we're going to discuss a material like that, um, if indeed we are going to read that kind of difficult um, testimony together. To give you a little context for this, little background, I think I learned early in my kind of postgraduate academic training that higher education, especially Christian higher education, and especially evangelical higher education, has tended to prioritize white voices, male voices in graduate and undergraduate education. And so, under the influence of mentors that I was glad to have many years ago, I began trying to incorporate voices that are not white and male, and even to provide or to give those kinds of voices a sort of center in a class, especially on something like Jesus, the church, and violence. And so Massengale's article was an example of that. A black man, black Catholic man, who was attesting to his own experiences in some regard, but also using his own voice and sensibilities to expose others to the horrors of how people like him are treated because of certain structures of power, violent structures of power in US society in particular. But what I'm discerning has happened is that as we've tried to, or as I've tried to center voices like that, the effect has been to make the experiences that someone like Massengale is reporting overly objectified. It's like we don't have quite the trust, um, the sort of mutual understanding as a class to be able to wade into material like that in a way that does not re-traumatize or violate, especially people who identify closely with the survivors that Massengale was describing. Um, and so this is a new layer that I think I need to address in our class and to think hard about how it is that we can prioritize certain voices that really need to be prioritized, but not in the process overly objectify the experiences that those voices attest to or um, fail to address how members of the class feel especially exposed by those kinds of testimony. Um, so I think it's important, obviously, in our class that we not hide ourselves from some of the horrors that we're trying to better understand and to oppose. But it's not acceptable for uh, people in our class to become the collateral damage of that because they feel like there's a kind of analysis happening that um, makes them feel like they're in a zoo and behind inside of a cage with people gawking at their pain. So we can't do that. Um, so that's a bit of this first line of criticism, and obviously, I think it probably goes without saying that these kinds of effects are not necessarily intentional, but precisely because of what we're studying, what the intentions are of incorporating material like this are not really decisive for how it should be incorporated or what actually happens when it is. I have to take responsibility for effects of how I arrange a class or um, introduce a discussion uh, beyond what I might be able to intend or foresee myself. I think that's part of what it means to engage these violent structures of power that I think we've probably felt some of you more acutely than others in our class. And so, one of the key ways that I think that we engage uh, these violent structures of power, and in this case, I think we're feeling a measure of, especially the structure of race. But one of the ways that we have to engage that, I think, is by better communication and the ability to hear when we have caused pain to others, in this case, when I have caused pain to others, and then to respond to that, to make changes, to see more clearly understand what this experience is like for others, and to allow that to inform how we go forward. So, part of the reason that I'm sharing this with you is not just that I think I kind of owe a more thoughtful response to our conversation on this past Wednesday, but also because I think it's important for me to invite further criticism of this kind as the class now develops in its second half. If we continue to produce this effect in the atmosphere of our class or in how the material is being considered, then it's important for you to be able to name that. And so this is an invitation for you to do that as you are able, since I know that it is costly sometimes to put yourself out there and to share pain that you're experiencing with others for whom it seems so remote um, or unfelt. So that's the first line of criticism that I wanted to just tell you how I'm digesting. The other one is this experience I think that some have had where it seems like how we are studying, I think especially the New Testament, if I heard this rightly. So it's not just the secondary material, but the New Testament witness in particular. It seems to kind of assume that the force of New Testament teaching is directed at people in positions of subordination and telling people how they're supposed to respond, how they're supposed to be faithful, or something like that, as opposed to a more clear and perhaps abiding emphasis on New Testament teaching as exposing injustices, violence that operates systemically in our lives, and allowing the authority of Scripture to bring that to light so that it can be criticized, illuminated, perhaps unmasked, and not necessarily move too quickly to what that implies for how we are to respond, especially from positions of subordination. I think one of the difficulties here is that the New Testament, rhetorically speaking, is often addressed to audiences that are in positions of subordination. But that's not really an excuse, I don't think, for centering that kind of a figure too much in our class. And so I'm going to be thinking about uh, how we can frame the testimony, the witness of the New Testament differently, so that that isn't kind of its most immediate effect, and to concentrate in a way that is, I think, appropriate on its prophetic force, not to tell people what to do from positions of weakness, but to expose, for the sake of justice and reform and meaningful peacemaking, the kinds of systemic violence that we are up against. And some of us are up against more than others. I think one of the challenges here for me is that as I have taught this class before, and even at the beginning of our class, one of the criticisms that I have received is the sense that this class is addressed too much to people that need to have a kind of initiation into systemic kinds of power and violence, where that's something that's already relatively clear for so many of us because of the bodies that we are and how those bodies have been positioned by those systemic forces, so that you haven't been able to afford to ignore them, and you already have a kind of education in them. And from those quarters, sometimes I have heard the plea for more direct attention to uh, what the New Testament has to say about how to engage those violent forces in our life. But I think as I've done that, the effect has been to sort of assume too much about what the audience of New Testament teaching is, so that the burden of its commands or its call upon the Christian life is being felt too much by people who are on the underside of our systems of power, as if it were your job to figure out how to undo the violence of our world, when in fact, a great deal of the burden lies with how the powerful need to repent. So that's another tension that I'll be continuing to think through as I prepare our class sessions. And I'm mentioning it now because, again, I want to invite you openly to name that sense, if that's coming across more in future sessions of our class in a way that you're finding to be burdensome in the wrong sort of way. That criticism remains important and welcome, and I invite you to voice it as you feel able to do so during class, or obviously outside of class, to me more privately. I did come away from our session on Wednesday, um, as I said at the beginning, thankful for those of you who shared, as you did, the resources that I think that gives us for going forward. I am concerned about an upcoming session where I think some of the same dynamics could reemerge. And so I'm thinking especially hard about that one. That's the session on, it's called Christian Violent Resistance, I think, or something like that in the syllabus. But as difficult as the conversation was on Wednesday, and as disappointed, I think, as I felt myself, in some ways that this is the experience for some of you in the class, I was somewhat consoled by the sense that some of you wanted to engage this challenge in our class and not simply turn away from it, which would be perfectly understandable. And so I'm thankful for that kind of family commitment that you initiated. That is not deserved, but an act of grace on your part. And I trust that all of us, from the different positions that we're coming from in the to the class, will be taking that criticism to heart and thinking about how it might helpfully, appropriately condition our participation in the class, so we're mindful of the sorts of burdens that are being brought to the class. So I think that's enough from me on this. If you feel like I'm not really hearing you still on some of these matters, of course, please continue to try to call or improve my understanding as you're able. But I hope that this response will perhaps encourage some more fruitful directions for our discussions going forward.